Dear friends, it's my distinct pleasure right now to be speaking to Chris King. You'll know a lot about him in the next few minutes. I met Chris for the first time right now online, and that is, I can see him and he can see me. But we're on a common email list that includes scientists looking at a biological explanation for consciousness and other such matters, including the nature of reality. So first of all, Chris, thank you for joining me.
Oh, delighted. Honored, I should say.
Where are you right now?
Auckland, New Zealand.
Auckland. Is that where you've been all your life, or where are you from?
I'm from New Zealand, but I split. Half my life is on a wilderness community in the Coromandel, and half here because I was teaching at university in Auckland.
Okay, and what were you teaching in Auckland, the university?
Mathematics, chaos theory.
I see. Well, let's start at the beginning. I'm very honored to have you on this conversation. We're going to reach ultimately millions of people, not that it matters to you, but I'd like our audience to know a little bit about your background, where you grew up and how you got into what you do now.
Okay, well, I grew up in a small, a kind of farming town, middle-sized town in New Zealand. Mm-hmm. I went to university a year early. My entire family was a medical family. My mother was a nurse, my father a doctor, general surgeon, and my brother was a surgeon as well. But I went to university a year early and I hadn't taken biology in school, and I'd intended to. I'm going to turn off, you'll have to edit this, but my emailer was on. Distracting with dings. I didn't take biology in school. And then I went to university a year early and got a straight A run, but I couldn't do the medical intermediate. So I had to face that I was taking a science degree. Then I took chemistry, physics, and maths as a standards kind of scientific starter, if you like. Then I decided to do physics, but at the time physics was nuclear physics and very worried about radiation and a little bit draconian in the way it was being taught. And I got very depressed and I decided I will have to do mathematics, even though it's not my sort of specialist of choice. And afterwards, the physics department all had radiation disasters. They were licking their paintbrushes and got leukemia. So I'm really glad I didn't. But I love physics. Physics is the science of the whole mystery of existence and consciousness and the universe and so on. So mathematics became like a keyboard of reality. Because if you are a mathematician, you can at least understand what equations are. And if you're reading a physics paper, it's not completely opaque. So it gave me an opportunity to look out at the world and to look out at life and biology from that viewpoint. Then I went to England as a student, graduate student, and I took LSD, and then I realized immediately that there are mysteries to reality that are as absolutely confounding. If I mention the standard model of physics, it probably sounds very boring to other people, but the standard model of physics is an absolutely extraordinary mandala that has the weak force and electromagnetism symmetry broken from one another, so that radioactivity can happen. And then the color and nuclear forces bind the quarks together. And the first two are twofold, attractive, repulsive, and then the color and nuclear forces are threefold. And so they are making a different geometry. And then finally, gravity is universally attractive and makes this complete picture of cosmology that happened in the symmetry breaking at the cosmic origin. And the thing that's absolutely beautiful about it is that it creates a fractal architecture in the universe. So we tend to think of everything as ball and stick model of chemistry. And cosmology generally works in terms of overall energy. So we talk about black holes, and we talk about cosmic inflation, and we talk about dark energy and so on. And then life appears to become irrelevant, that it is just some accidental phenomenon on the surface of planets that's of no cosmological significance. Now, this is completely incorrect, because the way the laws of nature broke symmetry evokes a fractal interactive structure. So the climax of the universe interactively occurs as quarks combine to make hadrons, then atomic nuclei, then you end up with 100 chemical elements, then you get molecules, and then when they interact, and particularly in the sort of context where the early Earth and biogenesis occurred, they start to polymerize to make fractal structures. And those fractal structures ultimately lead to tissues and brains and ourselves. And so there's a fundamental, it's a bit of a schizophrenic mismatch in science, that life is not recognized as the cosmological climax of the universe. So that's what I got into, is trying to understand biogenesis and from a mathematical point of view, how this could happen.
So I have a lot of questions, and I'll ask them in a moment. But then what you are saying is that the universe is becoming aware of itself through us.
Absolutely. And I really recognize the role that you play, particularly in biophysics and meaning, to keep re-stressing. You know, we've mentioned this together, but consciousness is primary. And I have to tell you, I just mentioned that I did a terrible thing to myself, lifted a very heavy bag of mortar, and I nearly tore my sacrum off my pelvis.
Oh, I'm sorry, Jim.
It's all right. I'm recovering. I'm endlessly recovering. But there's a point here. Consciousness is primary. We all go through what I would call the long tunnel of conscious existence. That is, everything we know, and you are very strong about this, everything we know and experience comes universally and exclusively through our subjective experience. And our subjective experience of the universe is really a shared consensual conscious experience that you and I are now sharing on this video. And the universe is what I want to say back to this is, however, the universe is necessary, because consciousness can't shape itself. When we go and look at nature and see the extraordinary complexity of it and the assumptions that conscious humans make about it, once we investigate, get contradicted in multitudes of ways, and then we come to terms with this extraordinary difficult condition that is the mortal condition of the conscious being, the universe is necessary so that that entire manifestation can take place. So I agree with you that the universe can't be manifested without consciousness. And the Copernican approach to understanding it all from the outside first, we then paint ourselves into the corner, and the corner we paint ourselves into is the hard problem. Now, hiding behind the hard problem is something that scientists simply do not recognize, and that is conscious subjective volition has efficacy over the physical universe. Now, people leave free will out of the discussion. They try to curse it by saying it's not entirely free, because circumstances to a certain extent play a role in influencing what we do. But conscious volition has absolutely huge implications. So we're sitting here now in this dialogue, and I am clearly, you are clearly, I am clearly, subjectively, consciously representing in our behavior physical changes that are being recorded on this video. So our consciousness is transforming the universe as we speak. Now,
and transforming everyone else who's watching.
Yes. And so this is a kind of chain reaction. It's as dangerous as a nuclear chain reaction. on the universe. Now, it has all kinds of consequences. What happened to me in June was that I had spent 7 years unable to take psychedelics. For all my life, I've taken magic mushrooms, sacred mushrooms, as an oracle to guide my life. Important, it's like taking down Hardanger Fjord in Norway. It's an awfully long field. You can't see to the end of it. And sometimes your life jibes and you need to turn around. At that point, I take psychedelics to try to understand the overall flux of reality. So I couldn't do this for 7 years because I'm long-sighted, and there's a condition of acute closed-angle glaucoma that when your pupils dilate, the pressures build up in your eyes until they can literally overnight explode. So I ended up unable to do this for 7 years. Then I had a lens replacement operation. Then I tentatively, after it was all settled down about 6 months later, tentatively took a small amount of mushrooms again. And there's a technique, and you will appreciate it because it's exactly the technique that both Buddhist and Upanishadic meditation uses. And it's a combination of mindfulness to center yourself and then completely letting go, abandoning yourself. And there's a thing with psychedelics, which is that you can enter into a kind of internal meditative state. And the Huichol call this the Narika. It's like a portal. And when you let go and you don't allow your ego to push things left and right, you'll end up having all kinds of visions. You'll have visions of sex, you'll have visions of worries, everything. You try and let that all go. And it's like you fall down into the abyss. And then you have what's like an augmented near-death experience. It's got exactly those characteristics of an NDE, where people say that they were that they met the ultimate reality, and that in a sense it was them, and in a sense it was compassionately relating to their incarnation and kind of advising them to go back into their incarnation if they're going to survive, and in a more meaningful way deal with their incarnate existence.
Let me ask you two more questions, and then I find this totally fascinating. How, if I may ask you, how old are you now?
77.
Okay, so you're 2 years older than I am. I'm 75. Yeah, you practice meditation as well, right?
Yes.
And right now, are you teaching as well? Do you have a teaching position?
No, I retired in 2009.
Okay, but this group that we have, the biological physics, includes Nobel laureate and includes some very interesting people. They all sometimes agree, sometimes don't agree. Right. And I found your contribution very interesting, but I do want to ask you some questions right now. And if you give me some indulgence, I will start right now asking these questions. So first of all, you know, we're all familiar with this paper, The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics. So why is mathematics so effective in describing what is happening in nature? Where does mathematics exist? Does it exist in human consciousness? Or is it a property of the universe, or is it both?
I listened to your discussion with last week, and my take on mathematics, because I'm working from inside it, is that it's a language describing reality. Now, I've got reservations about the idea of abstract existence, because symbiotic existential cosmology, which came out of this experience in June, is a cosmology in which subjective consciousness regains its central role cosmologically, and it's complemented by the physical universe. And that's very like a wave particle type complementarity. And it comes from symmetry breaking generally being asymmetric. When symmetry breaks, it results in two complementary phenomena that are very, very different from one another. Now, I place mathematics in the following way, that mathematics is both a conscious linguistic process And it is also an objective linguistic process represented in its symbolism and the discussions that are made and recorded in mathematical texts and so on. So it has two manifestations, like the two manifestations that we're talking about of reality. Now that leaves very hypothetical, is mathematics, a lot of people like to talk about mathematics as an abstract reality about the universe. I think, like religions, we create mathematics, and there are a lot of different ways we could create it. And it's partly an imaginative process. It uses all the facilities a mathematician. There are significant differences, for example, in Mandarin speakers and English speakers, because Mandarin is more pictographic, and that affects mathematical reasoning as well. So I see mathematics as both subjective and objective, but whether it abstract is existing in the universe in itself, we don't know that the physical universe is manifest without consciousness being able to observe it. So I'm not sure that mathematics exists independent of consciousness either. Is that an answer?
Yeah, very good. Now, elaborating on that, Gödel's theorem, which says there are theorems that are true but can't be proved logically, basically, and yet they're true. Does Gödel's theorem suggest a creative process in the universe, a conscious creative process? Because here you're coming up with a theorem which you can't prove, and yet it works. And are these kind of breaks in mathematical logic? What does Gödel's theorem imply to you?
I would agree with you. It is showing that the stratified process of mathematical systems creates its own incompleteness. Now, whether that is because consciousness is transformative of physical reality, that might be a little bit of an analogy, but the mathematics of Gödel's theorem is posing that same paradox, if you like, of transformativeness and the architecture of order. And it's about order and chaos in a sense as well, because we know that the brain gravitates to the edge of chaos. We have the butterfly effect is the key kind of indicator of what chaos is. And if the butterfly's effect is too strong, everything becomes scrambled. But on the other hand, things don't get stuck in a rut. And the brain's a dynamical, it's got action potentials, but it's a dynamical organ that there's a lot of convincing evidence, and I released a paper too a couple of days ago that shows very clearly this edge of chaos phenomenon in the brain. And it even showed that psychedelics take you a little bit closer to the edge of chaos than normal consciousness. That's a powerful, it's not just a metaphor, but it's a powerful principle that affects all phenomena in the universe, from quantum chaos through to neurodynamic chaos. So Gödel's theorem is a kind of oracular mathematical representation of the same paradox.
Got it. Now, my next question is, when I go on the internet and I type out how many galaxies there are, they say 2 trillion galaxies, 700 sextillion stars, 60 billion possible habitable planets in the Milky Way galaxy. Given that on scale, our planet is one speck of dust in all the beaches of the world. And the other day, I went actually to capture this speck of dust on a beach, and I couldn't hold it in my hand. It flew away. This is planet Earth. On this planet, there's a species called Homo sapiens. How does this species come up with solving the mysteries of the universe? Are we fooling ourselves, or is there something to this whole science that we can solve the mystery of the universe?
Science in itself is incomplete, because science as it stands is a description of the physical aspect of cosmology.
Say that again.
science is essentially, it's trying to do consciousness research, but essentially science is committed to the physical aspect of cosmology. It's describing unified field theories, then it's describing physics, chemistry, biology as a tiered construction, a description of reality about the physical universe. It runs into...
Science itself is a product of consciousness, isn't it?
Yes, of course it is. But as it frames itself as a description, it frames itself from the outside looking in as a description of the world around us, and has tremendous trouble handling subjective consciousness. Now, therefore, science is a product of human consciousness. And you asked a slightly different question when you started, because you started talking about the speck of dust that is Earth looking out at the universe at large.
And in that one species, supposedly
yes,
has the solution.
Right. Now, what I would say is the symmetry breaking of the forces of nature, by evoking that fractal structure that makes tissues possible, that is part of a cumulative process that results in conscious life as well. So whether the universe, like I will come back in a minute and say, conscious volition implies a form of panpsychism, but we'll get to that. But that then means possibly the universe itself is subjectively conscious in some sense that we don't necessarily have the full handle on, but we interact with it because we are conscious.
Okay, go ahead, finish.
Okay, so that means that the climax that we see watching the evolution of life on Earth is a climax that leads to us consciously observing the universe as a whole. Now, everything that I can see from the empirical evidence about biogenesis, if you look out the Orion Nebula, there's hydrogen cyanide out there, there's formaldehyde, you can even find glycine. The universe has an intrinsic, I don't like to call it teleological, but it's the standard model of physics is going to evoke the circumstances that enable evolution of life to the conscious level. Now, if it happens on Earth, this is something connected with cosmology. It's not something, evolution is adventitious. So there's no guarantee that if we went and looked on another planet, they would look like us. They could be very different. But there's some senses in which they're very likely to be similar, because carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, biogenesis is the backbone of the 100 chemical elements. They're the most covalently structured elements, those light elements of life. Now, I would call that the sangral of biogenesis. That's the royal blood of biogenesis, CHNO. It's going to make the stuff of proteins. It's going to make the stuff of DNA. These molecules polymerize quite naturally. If you take hydrogen cyanide, the pentamer of hydrogen cyanide is adenine. That's one of the DNA bases. This is a cosmological process, and consciousness is a cosmological process, and consciousness is a climactic process of the universe becoming self-aware.
Let me go a little further then. I understand so far everything you've said, and I'm not a scientist, I'm a clinician. I trained in biology, I trained in neuroendocrinology, but I'm not a physicist.
That's science, Deepak. You're standing in both camps.
Now, if I go back to my tradition, Vedanta and Buddhism to some extent, and Kashmir Shaivism, the non-dual traditions, they say that what you call physical matter is actually a human construct for modes of knowing and experiencing consciousness. Before you can call something an atom or call something carbon, those are human names given to a certain kind of experience, cognitive or perceptual. And furthermore, a human cognitive perceptual. I construct a hadron collider and I see this little thing for a fraction of a second and it disappears. And I say, that's a Higgs boson. gives mass to the universe. Am
Yeah.
I not making up the whole thing? I mean, according to Vedanta, there is no physical universe. It's a human construct and a model for human perception and interpretation of human perception and cognition, that there is only consciousness appearing as the physical universe.
Okay, so I am an empiricist. Okay, I'm a mathematician, so I've got the ultimate liberty to be a theorist. But counter to that, because of my medical origins, there's this aspect of experimental science where we make conscious conjectures about the nature of reality. And whether they're philosophical or whatever, we then go out into nature and we do verify by empirical observation what we actually find out there. And we are finding out their conscious experiences, but they're conscious experiences about nature. And then those conscious experiences about nature teach us very oracular things about the nature of reality. So we discover the structure of DNA, we discover what cells are like, we discover wave and particle physics, and this modulates our conscious view of cosmology to make it fit better with what we consciously experience. So this is what I'm saying about the necessity of the physical universe, is it teaches consciousness what it is really about. And I have a very strong relationship, there are these endless tales we can tell, but my first sabbatical, I had taken LSD and I was concerned about three things. One, the entheogens, where were they on the planet? Two, Vedanta. I wanted to sample from the roots the Eastern tradition. The third one is science and where did life begin? So my first step was to go to India, and I had to leave my children and two partners and go to India, wander around. I just set myself up as a kind of street sadhu, put the red dot on my face and cavorted with beggars or whoever were in the streets, had a cheap hotel for 6 months. To experience exactly what you're talking about, but to experience from the everyday people in the street and how they felt as conscious entities, going to their little temples, ringing the bells, throwing the odd coin in. What was that view of reality? I've got a deeply respectful view, particularly of the oldest of the Upanishads, as a veridical journey. It's the same as the vision quest of the Huichols, in a different context, but it is a foundational root. You call it the wisdom tradition. It is. I respect that, and I think it's profoundly insightful.
Is the universe that we call see, everything you talk about, adenine, DNA, force fields, gravity, is the human name. We created that name to an experience. And then we constructed out of that the idea of a physical universe. But actually, that which we call the universe is not actually physical. Only when we observe it, it appears physical. And by the time we've observed it, it's moved on. Even by the time you observe a particle in a Hadron Collider. So what we call a particle is a moment of experience, a snapshot, a space-time event in consciousness. And that's all there is, space-time events in consciousness, given names, and we conceive, construct, govern, and become this thing that we call the universe, but it's our creation.
To a certain extent, but I could play that back in the following kind of way, that our consciousness isn't an instant. And so we come to what is consciousness itself. And when you take that overall view, there's another view of, if you even take the Vedantic view, and we talk about, my experience on the mushroom in June was basically Upanishadic. That is, Brahman, this is Brahman coming to me and saying compassionately, you are in the mortal coil. I am profoundly empathic with you in that condition, but if you want to fulfill your meaning in relation to me and the universe itself, you must go back into life and establish to save the diversity of life, because that is the incarnate manifestation of consciousness in the universe, and you are manifest incarnately. Your duty and role is to protect life. And this provides a slightly different cosmological view that mortal existence is the center of the cyclone. And we don't possess consciousness. You're conscious, I'm conscious. I can't see yours, you can't see mine. I know you are because you behave in a certain kind of way. You are vivacious, you have volition, you display the characteristics of a conscious sentient being. So we don't own consciousness. Now, is consciousness finite? Is it temporal? And you have these, Kali, you have all of the Vedantic panoply of different views on this. But what I'm trying to say in a nutshell, we do not own consciousness. Moreover, the conscious moment that we are both experiencing now is not an instant. It is a quantum of the present, and it is invoking both the future and the past very subtly in our conscious experience, because to survive, we have to anticipate reality. So consciousness is implicitly or intuitively anticipative, and it also includes history because of memory and the whole trace of continuity. So it's like a quantum of the present. Now, does that exist in space-time? I don't think it does. It's complementary to space-time. And so consciousness itself can be plausibly described as being eternal in the sense that religions try to describe. Now, there's sorry.
Oh, go ahead, finish.
Well, there's a second component to it, which is life is immortal. Evolution is immortal. It is not mortal like we are as organisms. So we have a relationship both with immortality, because life as a process is immortal, and we have a relationship with eternality, because our very conscious existence is in a sense eternal. So we're carrying all the three components of manifest reality within us.
Three components: timeless, time-bound, and what's the third?
The eternal, the immortal, and the incarnate mortal. And that's the best of all possible worlds, because we've learned that complex life can't exist without symbiotic. The eukaryotes, we are all symbiotic organisms, and sexuality was essential for complex organisms to exist, because the first eukaryote cells, all the higher cells with nuclei, came from an endosymbiosis between the two fundamental life forms, archaea and bacteria, which are like complementary. Archaea are like geological organisms, bacteria are like fermenting organisms and photosynthetic organisms. Now, they came together in an endosymbiosis, which is the most extraordinary secondary event to the origin of life. And we are all of that stuff. Now, sexuality is at the root of eukaryote existence, because there's a peacock's tail race between parasites and hosts. And to be parthenogenic is eventually lethal. So complex life can only exist if it's sexual. But if it's sexual, it's mortal, because we have to be altruistic enough to contribute only half ourselves to the next generation. So we're stuck with mortality. Now, mortality is the ultimate antidote to ego, because if we accept mortality, all the religious traditions tend to gravitate to immortality and eternality, and then they become egotistical because they are seeking eternality. But if we accept our mortality, the only things we can meaningfully do in our existence are the things that benefit life as a whole. So we solve the problem that Buddhism tries to solve without having to address it, if you like.
What's the difference between immortality and eternality?
Eternality is outside space-time as a whole. So we could look at the universe, and from alpha to omega, if we stood sideways on looking at the whole of space-time, from the beginning of the universe to the end, that's eternal. It's like space-time, space plus time, the whole four-dimensional picture is eternal, because time. Now, this is very complicated, because science will say the beginning is just like the South Pole. It's nowhere special. And immortality is a different kind of thing, because it's temporal, but not doomed to death. So we see evolution as changing and evolving all the time, and it goes on and on and on. And seriously, evolution, the age of the universe is about 13.5 billion years. Evolution has been going for 3.6 billion years. We had to wait for a whole cycle of supernovas to generate the biological elements. So the actual history, like we're stardust and so on, that goes back upwards of 10 billion years out of the 13 billion years of the universe's history. Now, this is something that I call paradise on the cosmic equator. Eventually, the universe becomes mature enough that it makes conscious life, and then the universe can settle into the kind of Brahman-Atman relationship and start to really understand itself. That's what we're in the process of doing. We as biota are, and I don't even think it's teleological, it's wildly at the edge of chaos. It's fecund, it's creative. We are ending up consciously witnessing these mysteries. You say, how can someone on a speck of dust in the galaxy have any concept of what the universe as a whole is like? We can do this because we are in relationship with Brahman. And so we are ourselves the interface. Aurobindo had a concept called supermind, which was a little bit between Brahman and Atman. So the person in a deep meditative state is still a biological organism. Then, you know, you can say that's not really Brahman. They've still got a brain. They're still an organism. Yes, okay, but that's the supermind. That's the portal to Brahman. And Huichols who take peyote, they call it the Narika. And when they have their psychedelic experience, it's like a portal to the spirit world. We have that portal. Because we have that portal, and if we take advantage of it through meditation or through entheogens, we then fulfill the universe's climactic discovery process, self-discovery process.
So
and it's a big...
No, I get what you're saying. Let's talk a little bit about mortality. So the day will come when you and I are definitely going to disappear as the biological organism with this mind, this personality, and on and on. Is there an aspect of us that survives that? Look,
this is going to be slightly difficult and embarrassing, but when I take mushrooms, I get this universal feeling that I am not telepathic, but empathically in contact with all the spirit beings throughout space-time. And so they are potentially, I wrote a song and it says, we are the eternal gypsy spirits of the universe. We have been here since it all began. We will outlast its final passing. We are here to free the heart of man. It's like, yes, we can become conscious of that. And in a sense, that's disembodied reality. Now, I don't know and can't know. Look, 7 years ago, I fell off my bike with no cycle helmet on, absolutely conked myself on the concrete, passed out. I had no memory of what had happened. I dragged my bike, didn't know what had happened. I arrived at my house with my bike crushed, blood all over the garage doors. So it's a physical experience that there's a gap in my consciousness there, which could have been death. Now, I can't tell you, and I don't know that anyone that has an NDE can give a verifiable experience of what it's actually like to be really dead and gone. But from the luxury of incarnate existence in the near-death experience, it appears to me that consciousness itself makes a kind of continuous interface between the eternal and the incarnate. So we are, in the eternal nature of existence, we continue to exist.
Chris, right now, are you with your family? Do you have a family?
Yes.
Yeah, tell me about your family. Children, grandchildren?
Yes.
And
I live with my partner of 50 years. She was one of the two partners that I first met Hallie, who is a very wonderful person who I am still, she lives with another person. We lived as a menage a trois for 3 years until I went to India. I have 5 grandchildren, 4 children. We all keep very, very close. The extended family is very strong, partly because of the land we bought that kind of binds us to the earth.
what's your vision for the rest of your life, for yourself?
Well, the result of the mushroom trip is that I've got symbiotic existential cosmology, and I regard that as a sacred duty to convey to the world, which has 3 principles. The first is biogenic, which I already described. The second thing is that you go from the extreme of a transcendental experience, and you've got to get back down onto Earth. And when you come back down to on Earth, there's the question of conscious volition, which I mentioned before. Now, the second component of symbiotic existential cosmology is that if we have conscious volition over the physical universe, there are implications of this. And the implications are a form of primitive panpsychism or animism, that the universe itself has conscious potential within it. Now, that could apply to thunderstorms. It could apply to lots of things. Anything that's an edge of chaos process could be quanta. Quanta have, in a sense, free will, because each single instance of a quantum is very idiosyncratic, unlimited, uncertainty. It's only when you do the same experiment again and again and again, it starts to form a pattern, and that's the born interpretation of the probability. It also is, in a sense, conscious because the wave aspect extends throughout space-time. So this implies a form of panpsychism. And the third component is symbiosis, because what we discover about the universe, that there's been a kind of male capitalistic view of evolution, of survival of the fittest through competition. Now, this kind of model doesn't make mathematical sense, and it doesn't make empirical sense, because when you look at predators and prey, it looks like the predators are consuming the prey. But when you look at the antelopes, if the tigers weren't there, the antelopes would multiply until they would simply eat all the grass, and then they would go to boom and bust. So then the things that look like they are tooth and claw bloodthirsty, namely the predators, smooth that process out by limiting the unlimited exponential. You know, our idea of the gross national product, it's gross, right? It's unhinged predatory behavior. Any species will do that on its own. When the predators enter into it, everything starts to smooth out. Now, there's a huge lesson here. Why does the Amazon reach climax diversity? It reaches climax diversity because the insects are out to get the plants. It's not because of plant competition. They've proved this empirically looking at tropical species. The plants don't compete to get diverse. The insects eat. The dominant plant species makes itself vulnerable to insect predation. So then the insects that we are, you know, too much insecticides destroying our insects are what causes plant diversity to reach climax. So the things within evolution that appear to be adversarial are actually symbiotic. Now, there's a lesson here for humanity, because we as a species, we have to eat food. We can have pretensions to technological utopia. We can think we're just it from bit. We can think that we can do this all with AI, but actually we are a biological species in symbiosis with the biosphere. If we don't respect that and give our prime, sense of meaning in life to life as a whole, we will become extinct. And when you say we're a speck of dust in the galaxy, people say, why can't we see all the other stuff? And then one of the prime hypotheses is that technological civilizations go on to shorter and shorter witching hour timescales and then self-destruct. They boom and bust themselves just the way we're not supposed to. So the third, that's what symbiotic existential cosmology is teaching us. First, life is the climax. Secondly, the whole thing is conscious, like you're saying, and became fully conscious when eukaryotes emerged. And finally, symbiosis is our meaning in life. And to protect it in this day and age, when we've got nuclear weapons, climate crisis, and biodiversity is on the back burner, this is the religious spiritual core of our future, is to protect life as a whole.
Thank you. This has been an amazing conversation.